So welcome back, everyone. I'm honored to, I'm going to introduce our speakers for the next session, which is on smart and sustainable cities. Before I do the introductions and turn the podium over to each of the, my panelists, I just wanted to, present a little bit of background, just general comments on this topic, and then we'll have each panelist talk a bit about the issues. So I'm an economist and have done a fair amount of work on cities. And I just want to talk a little bit about a topic that maybe is not so familiar to many of you, which is why cities are important for innovation, and then also why cities are important for achieving a solution to greenhouse emissions. So the first point that I want to make about cities is that economists have been studying them for a very long time, and typically economists believe cities exist principally for two reasons. First, cities tend to make people more productive and therefore generate higher wages. And secondly, cities generate amenities. So you might think of beautiful architecture, or you might think of restaurants or theater, et cetera, and that these spaces make cities attractive to people as consumers, and that causes people to move from rural areas to cities. But the second point that I wanted to make is that more recently, especially over the last 10 to 15 years, economists have also been focusing on cities because they are dramatically greener than rural areas. And what I mean by greener is that they emit far less CO2 per capita than rural areas. And the reasons why cities tend to be so green is that, first, people in high-density locations tend to travel shorter distances. And of course, one of the major reasons why we emit carbon is because of cars and other transportation systems. Second reason why cities tend to be much greener than rural areas is that people in cities use public transportation more, and public transportation is a lot greener than having people drive around cars. And a third engineering reason why cities tend to be a lot greener than rural areas is that large buildings tend to have lower surface area to volume ratios, which means that they dissipate less heat, and that makes them more energy efficient. And I'm just going just to spend a couple of minutes building out each one of these different facts about cities, which I think will help tie together what the various panelists are going to be talking about. So the first question that you might have is, why is it that cities make us more productive? And there's been a lot of research done on the fact that humans become smarter when they interact with more people, right? So when you talk to me, I become smarter. And then when I talk to someone else, they become smarter. And in cities, you get that interaction much more easily because people are constantly meeting with each other. So dense working environments tend to lower the cost of transporting goods. That was an early reason why cities tended to have higher productivity. But now major reasons why cities tend to cause people to become more productive is because people can move around more easily, and also ideas flow more easily when you're close to other people. And so, this is something you probably have noticed in your own experience, that you talk more with people who are close to you than with people who are further away. Relatedly, denser business networks also tend to raise productivity. It's easier to find find specialized services in cities than it is in rural areas. And so one of the big challenges of cities is to increase the density of people living together while also making cities more pleasant to live in, essentially increasing the amenities associated with living in cities. And just to give you some sense of how big these productivity impacts are of cities, I just want to give you a few numbers here. One thing that you can see in the United States, for example, or in Japan, is that there are enormous regional differences in productivity, by which I mean how much output an individual creates, how much value added a person creates in a city versus in a rural area. And in fact, when you think about the history of the world or what development means in most countries, it's strongly associated with people moving from low productivity rural areas to high productivity cities. And just to give you a sense, just based on data from the United States, I come from New York. New York has some of the highest productivity rates in the United States. If U.S. per capita productivity levels rose to those of New York City, U.S. GDP would grow by over 40%. Right? So what holds down a lot of GDP in the U.S. is the fact that people are not as productive as people in New York, or you could pick your favorite city, San Francisco, or so on. Now, what you also see in terms of real estate development and architecture is that one of the ways in which cities have increased their importance as societies is by building up and building out. So building up is the creation of taller buildings, and I think Mr. Mori is going to talk more about that. And building out is something that you see in New York, in Tokyo, in Boston, where you see the cities expand into areas that were originally, say, water bays and things like that. And that also enables more people to live in cities, and then you get these productivity impacts. Now, of course, when locations become more productive and they become nicer, that tends to raise housing costs. And that happens because land prices in cities are bid up by more productive firms and also by workers when they earn higher wages. But it's also being bid up by the fact that cities offer these amenities, so that it's not probably of no surprise to anyone here that if you take two cities, say like San Francisco and Detroit, they have very similar populations, but land prices are far higher in San Francisco than Detroit, and one major reason why that is because San Francisco is seen aesthetically as a nicer place than Detroit, and I say this as a graduate of the University of Michigan, so I know Detroit well, and it's not an accident that many of you have been to San Francisco and have not visited Detroit on a vacation. And one way in which amenities matter economically is that Ed Glaeser, who's one of the great urban economists, has found that cities that have better amenities, that are architecturally nicer, think Paris or think other beautiful cities, they tend to grow faster than cities with worse amenities. And so you get that interaction between the amenities driving up the productivities, driving up the ability to pay for more amenities, and we get richer and nicer locations. I want to finish up by talking a little bit about sustainability and cities. And here I'm just going to draw on some research by Ed Glaeser and Matt Kahn, to give you some sense about what cities mean for carbon emissions. And here, part of what I want you to realize is that there's a lot of talk about carbon emissions in terms of trying to reduce carbon emissions, but we actually already have a very important solution that's tried and tested, which is just get people living closer together. So here on this slide, what I'm showing you is the 5 largest metropolitan statistical areas in the United States. So essentially think of these as greater locations for urban centers in different locations. So New York is the largest city in the US. It has a population of around 20 million. LA has a population of 13 million, and so on. Down Chicago, Dallas, and Houston, you can see the population in the first columns. And when you look at this slide, you can see a couple of key features of what drives carbon emissions. So the average household in New York emits on the order of 30 tons of carbon, 30 tons of carbon per year, economists have estimated how much a ton of carbon damages the environment through hurricanes and all that kind of stuff. And global warming, and come up with a number that about 1 ton of carbon costs the world about $77. Some people would say that's a higher number. I'm choosing kind of a mid-range number. And so for the typical household in New York, producing 30 tons of carbon in a typical year, the damage to the planet that household is generating is $2,479. Now, that number is brought down largely because in New York, we tend to live in highly dense locations. We have very tall buildings, not a lot of surface area exposed to the cold New England winters. If you move to Los Angeles, it's less dense, but also you have fewer temperature extremes. The climate, you need fewer days to heat your house, and so LA is a little bit cleaner than New York, and the damage to the environment that each household is generating in terms of carbon emissions is a little lower than New York. Move to Chicago, right, where it's now colder, but also people are living in less dense regions, and the damage goes up by about 30%. And then if you move to many of the southern cities like Dallas and Houston, you've got that really bad combination, at least in terms of the environment, which is very low dense living. These are car cities, you drive everywhere, and on top of it, they're very hot locations, so you're running your air conditioning all the time, and the damage levels are about 50% above those of New York, and even more relative to Los Angeles. And of course, as you move to a rural area, you're going to be driving even more. Your house is going to be highly exposed, and so your carbon damage is even higher. And so, but part of what I want you to see in these numbers is that, if you could build cities that look more like New York, you can drive down carbon emissions fairly substantially without any newfangled technologies being implemented, except for perhaps functioning public transportation networks. I also want to kind of emphasize, and this is something that has come out in a number of papers, in particular work by Jaque and Mori, that at least in the United States, a lot of government policies work against urbanization. There's a strong sense that cities are are not good are to be avoided. And we've seen in the United States a real revolution happen in property rights regulation, in which today, when you want to build in especially an East Coast or in a coastal city, especially in blue states, that is, democratic states are particularly bad in this dimension. Zoning rules and regulatory rules allow existing residents to typically block or significantly delay new construction. And these kinds of restrictions, economists have estimated, dramatically increase the cost of housing in cities like Boston, New York, and San Francisco. The engineering cost of building a tall building is actually not that high relative to the number of people who can live in that building. What is very expensive is to try to get all the building permits together and implement the eminent domain and other things necessary to build. These kinds of restrictions have really big costs on workers, probably on the order of $3,700 per worker living in one of these cities. It probably lowers US GDP by close to 4%. That then gets coupled with underinvestments in public transportation. At least in the United States, Japan actually looks way better than the US in this respect. The other area in which Japan looks way better than the United States is that US has very cheap gasoline, and typically when gas is cheap, people don't move to cities because they can cheaply drive their cars around rural areas. Japan, of course, has much higher gas taxes and is much more urbanized than the United States. Progressive taxation, for all its benefits, tends to penalize high-income locations like New York and effectively transfer money to rural areas. And then, of course, both Japan and the United States engage in substantial agricultural subsidies, which tends to move people to rural areas. And so these policies, which we usually think of in other terms, actually have a fairly important carbon impact. And so I just want to end up by just saying that one of the key issues for the future is that that cities that are easier to live in also tend to be more productive cities because you get more people living in the cities and they get smarter and they earn higher wages. And so one thing that we want to try to achieve is that virtuous cycle of higher density work environments and higher amenities. And I also kind of want to leave you with one last thought about cities before we turn it over to the panel, which is to say, again, sustainability issues are typically or often seen as a trade-off between carbon emissions and productivity. We have this sense that the only way we can reduce carbon emissions is by lowering our standards of living. But as you saw in terms of the different carbon emissions across different types of cities, having a sensible urban policy may offer us a means to have it all. That is, we become more productive and we lower emissions. And of course, one big question for all countries is what policies should be implemented to achieve this outcome. So I'm going to stop here in terms of my own discussion about cities, and I want to now turn it over to our panelists, who each are going to be talking about a different dimension about increasing density and increasing amenities and increasing the sustainability of cities. I'm really delighted by the quality of the different participants that we have here. First, we have to my immediate right, Andrés Jaque, who is Dean of the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University, and he is the founder of the Office for Political Innovation, an architectural practice based in New York and Madrid, and has been teaching advanced design studios at Columbia since 2013. The Office for Political Innovation develops projects that are intended to bring inclusivity into the built environment, and it has been awarded the Silver Lion for Best Research Project at the 14th Venice Biennale, among other awards. Seated next to him is Hiroo. I'm sorry, excuse me. Seated next to him is Yumiko Noda, who is chairman and representative of Veolia, Japan. KK, a specialist in city planning. She is on several committees and boards in the public and private sectors, including serving as vice chair of the Board of Counselors and chair of the Committee on Environment at K-Danren, which is the a very prestigious organization of managers. And a member of the Council for the Realization of the Vision for a Digital Garden City Nation of the Cabinet Secretariat, and a member of the study group for designing a growth-oriented, resource-autonomous circular economy at the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, also known as METI. And then seated next to her, we have Hiroo Mori, who is Director and Executive Vice President of Mori Building Company. He joined the Mori Building in 1995 and became Managing Director in 2000. In 2013, he was appointed President and CEO of the Mori Hospital Corporation, managing the Grand Hyatt in Tokyo, Andaz Tokyo, and private membership clubs. He continues to have a wide range of managerial responsibilities within the Mori Building Group, including supervising its property management operations, as well as overseeing the Shanghai World Financial Center project, which opened in 2008 in Shanghai. So without any further ado, I want to turn the floor over to Andrés, and please begin your presentation. And do you know how to use this?
Thank you very much, David. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very happy to be in conversation with Yumiko and Hiroo. I would like to start with a personal note. Then I will talk a little bit about New York and how New York is a laboratory where many of the ideas that David was sharing have been tested and have been experimented. And then I'll talk about GSAP, the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation in Columbia, where innovation related to smartness and to sustainability is very intensely impacting the world. But let me start with a personal note. I've been working, I'm an architect, I've been working, and I founded 20 years ago the Office for Political Innovation. And the term innovation that is being discussed today has radically been transformed by by operating in the ecological paradigm facing climate and biodiversity crisis. What I think is very important to understand is that we're moving to a very different notion of where design is allocated, where human existence is allocated, which is a very different notion of what a city is. These are projects that I've been working on in the last years with the Office for Political Innovation, and it's also important to understand that design has also changed. Design is no longer something that translates into buildings all the human intentions, but actually the decoupling between the material mobilization and the effects that we want to have with that have changed. Basically, with decoupling materiality with activity and interaction. And buildings are being transformed to allocate forms of interaction that are very different without really producing new buildings. This idea of repurposing became incredibly important as a tool to face environmental crisis. But not only that, infrastructures became as important as architecture, as public space. For instance, these are projects that we've been developing in which the way the city of New York deals with waste becomes the crucial opportunity for architecture and design to have an impact in the reduction of emissions, in the reduction also of inequality produced by environmental injustice. And in places like New York, Tokyo, Paris that were mentioned before, waste became as important, for instance, as human activity and a huge limit and engine for economies. So dealing with repurposing buildings, waste, infrastructures, is playing the role that in the past buildings was playing. And also the way nature and more than human life becomes integrated in what we do, and I'm sure we will talk about that. Sustainability no longer can be only about reduction of emissions, but it's also about reparation. In most of the global cities, it's not only about how we reduce the impact of buildings, infrastructures, and public space, but it's also about how we use the opportunities we have to redevelop the city to repair what it's been received by previous generations and other ways of thinking. And that's something that goes to the details of materiality as much as space. Materiality, like in this building, that allows to sequestrate carbon, but also to produce biodiversity, to nurture life in the very materiality that hosts life, and I will talk more about that through experiments that we're doing at Columbia, but also in the possibility of use buildings to repair the biodiversity of a whole region. For instance, this is a building that captures water, rainfall, and then distributes to specially engineered ecosystems that are imbricated within the building so that the insects and the animal life and that is being lost through pesticides and fertilizers and the vegetation that also was eliminated through this massive use of pesticides and fertilizers basically can be repaired and restored. And that's something that buildings can do, and that is a way to intervene. What is the notion of civic society that we can think of at the time of climate crisis? This is a painting from the 1500s, and it's by Gentile Bellini, and it represents what civic society was. What is very important here is that we see the moment in which the cross of the procession falls into the canal, and basically the canal, civil society, it's needed, an alliance between the two of them is needed to restore the presence of God. This is something that is being seen by many of the experts of innovation and sociology of technology and science as a moment in which probably the first ecological conscience was expressed. Ecology is very much about relationships, how different actors relate. And how different actors relate is crucial to face this. Climate crises are the result of how societies are produced. And to face climate crisis also requires societies to be reassembled. And on that, the possibility to mobilize design is crucial. Design, development is a key tool to reassemble societies. And this is something, for instance, that is also about the smartness. This is the Parliament of the Ocean that the city of Venice is producing now, and it's a way to put together the sensing capacity that is being distributed not only in the canals, but also in the lagoon and beyond the lagoon to monitor the evolution of the sea level, and then combine it, present it in a space that allows to policymakers, artists, scientists work together and connect human brain and human and societal capacity to regulate and to act with the sensing capacity of technology. And that's very connected to the work that Mary was talking about before of AI working together with human brain. But of course, this also requires design. This also requires infrastructures. And that's what cities now are doing. reassembling the societies, reassembling the social and the ecological is probably the main role of cities now. And that's actually what operating in a climate paradigm often means. This is something, of course, that is at the center of what GSAP and the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation is pioneering for the world. And it's very, very directly anchored to a whole tradition of nurturing high-level knowledge and scholarship and connecting it with practice and research. And that's something, of course, that is, for those that are familiar with the disciplines of the field environment, is very much connected to Avery. Avery Hall, that is considered the library of reference for the built environment in the world. But it's also New York. And New York is the place where and in Colombia, where Saskia Sassen conceptualized the notion of global cities. And global cities have changed and keep being experimented. And New York keeps being built through architecture, through infrastructures, through ecology, through design. 432, the building that we see here, it's been probably the prototype of a big part of the high-end residential schemes that have been developed around the world. What is important when we see the image, the first conceptual image that was produced by its designers, is to see how the materiality of the building is directly connected to operations and designs that are developed at different scales. The design of the glass, this low iron glass, ultra clear glass that produced this high-end feeling of high transparency, of connecting the outside with the inside, and not only that, to nurturing, allowing coatings to be so effective that the transmittance of the blue spectrum of the natural light can be maximized, so the sky looks bluer from these interiors by the combination of low iron glass with specific coatings that control the spectrum of the color of the transmittance. But this effect of the glass, the transparency, the perception of an environment that is more blue than what it actually is was combined with an overall action of redesigning the sky of New York that was addressed by Michael Bloomberg in 2012 through the Clean Heat Project. The Clean Heat Project was the way the city incentivized the replacement of oil-based, oil fuel boilers with natural gas boilers. And that is why, and David's remarks on how Los Angeles actually was performing very differently because of the heating, the no need for heating, it's actually reflected on the importance, the criticality of how boilers are fueled in a place like New York. This image is no longer possible because the sky of New York no longer has this kind of smoke. And this blue or yellowish sky of New York of the 1990s, those that are familiar with it, it's disappeared because the NOx actually in the air is no longer in New York. But this replacement of the boilers, combined with the fact that, fracking was banned in New York State by Governor Cuomo, made automatically, almost automatically, in 1 year, that the NOx of New York moved from New York to Susquehanna Valley, where Marcellus Shale is, where the natural gas is extracted, where the trucks that are making possible the extraction of the gas are permanently running, and where the emissions are taken. So this is specifically what is happening to New York. As New York became bluer, Susquehanna Valley became more polluted. And this is something that is producing a huge divide, but also is limiting the capacity for New York to perform financially. It's basically this divide in which Susquehanna Valley is perceiving this, whereas the financial markets are perceiving the Marcellus Shale as that, or are reconstructing it like that, as an asset that can be traded through a smart interaction. The challenge now is how we bring together these two realities. Because the truth is that 40% of the high-end apartments in New York are vacant at this point. The practical density of the city is dropping, and that's happening around the world. And part of it is because the incapacity to integrate different societal stractums in the same city is actually limiting the capacity to create, in fact, this density. So the one challenge that we're seeing now in design, and the one methodological change that we are transforming, is basically to move from urban-rural divides to trans-territorial development. And this is something that is allowing for a very different kind of design, a design in which the rural is designed at the same time that the urban, that infrastructures are planned together with the way buildings are constructed, and the financial schemes are operating trans-territorially. That is something that, of course, provides amazing opportunities for development, and actually amazing opportunities also for pedagogical innovation. GSAP is transformed totally the way our degrees work, and is making it possible to train our graduates in interdisciplinary methodologies that allow them to work together with people from the School of Engineering, from SIPA, from the School of Climate, and also to take advantage of the capacity for real estate, planning, urban design, architecture to work together collaboratively to increase and to maximize the capacity of territories and cities to increase productivity. The second thing is that of course means a total transformation in the way we think of design. Columbia has pioneered the culture of studios, integrating knowledge collectively in this proximity that David was talking about to produce smartness. But that's also something that now has changed. And that also means that now the design is seen as something that is produced collectively, bringing together many different disciplines and stakeholders. And that also means that design is installed in the streets, in the territories that are affected, and there's no divide between the way that we work in the laboratories, and the laboratories are taken out there where they can produce designs like this. This is a paradigmatic design that is transforming the whole estuaries of New York. But what is important, that was developed by the KTORF, ESCAPE, and the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. What is important is that the transformation of Guaguanos Canal, a particular area that very successfully is producing actually an amazing transformation and increasing the productivity, is only working because it's combined with the whole reparation of the estuaries, and not only that, but also mobilizing oysters and ecosystems as an opportunity to work across scales and produce value that is sustainable. The second thing is, of course, that we're working, denying the possibility of a tabula rasa. Every design is happening on things that are already intervened. And this is crucial because the city, we have to understand that the city is actually where we're mining. A big part of the components, the materiality, the activities, the buildings are already in the city, and it's much more how we mobilize them. And through, and for instance, we're developing these systems to use machine learning to identify what are the parts of the city that require update, and what are the ones that can actually help doing that through reassociation, and using, of course, AI and machine learning as combined with design processes. And the last one is that we are witnessing a huge evolution in the way we understand how humans operate. And humans are inseparable from more than human life. And we're seeing cities as crucial devices to increase the capacity for humans to be entangled with larger spectrums of biodiversity. And this is, of course, crucial. And that we do from the scale of the materials. This is the Living Material Lab at GSAP that works to develop materials that keep life and that keep operating as ecosystems themselves, as an alliance between different species that is actually not making a separation between nature and architecture, but not only that, to producing interspecies alliances that allowed also to eliminate the notion of waste. What is waste for human becomes the habitat in which other animals can grow. And with these cycles of interspecies relationship, it's not only that we reduce the huge cost of managing waste, but also we do it in a way that we increase the biodiversity of cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. much for a lovely talk. And now I'd like to invite Mr. Mori to speak.
Thank you, David. And thank you very much for the opportunity, Professor Ito. Thank you. My remarks is in Japanese. Please use your translation device. 森ビルの森でございます。ありがとうございます。今日はちょっと都市化についてというか、まず都市について森記念財団が2008年から出しているレポートについて、ご紹介します。先ほどデイビッドさんがアメリカの各都市が、都市化にはあんまり逆行しているというのはかなり意外だったんですけど、おそらく我々が知っている都市というのは、アメリカの場合は大都市が中心なんだと思いますけど、実はこの、サーベイはですね、2008年から、世界の当初は44都市、今48都市ぐらいまで、広げて、6分野でですね、70以上もの指標で、都市の性格を全部、都市ごとに出してそのランキングをつけているものです。6つの分野というのは経済、研究開発、文化交流、居住環境、そして交通アクセスと、6つの分野での強みを弱みを、調べていくという、ことで、おかげさまでこの指標が非常に今、国内でも取り上げられて、国土交通省とか、東京都からこの結果を、使っていろんなところでプレゼンテーションしていただいているようです。これすごい特徴的なのがですね、上位4つの都市が全く変わっていません。当初はニューヨーク、ロンドン、パリ、東京の順番だったんですが、2012年ロンドンオリンピックのある年にロンドンがニューヨークを抜いて今一番なんです。今は、ロンドン、ニューヨーク、そして2016年に東京がパリを抜いて東京、パリという順番です。本来はこれをもとにですね、2020年の東京オリンピック、2021年になりましたけど、そこに東京が都市基盤整備をすることで、さらに3位から2位、1位へと狙っていたわけですけども、なかなかそうはいかないということです。今、実は直近のデータ、これは2022年の結果ですけども、2022年の11月に発表してますので、2022年の夏頃にサーベイをしましたが、だいぶパリが東京に肉薄してきています。これは順位だけなので分かりにくいんですが、ロンドンが圧倒的に上の方、次にニューヨークもかなり上がって、東京が点数は下げたけども3位を維持して、パリがそこに肉薄してきていると。今年はパリのワールドカップラグビーがありますので、また観光レベルも上がると、ちょっと2023年の結果は厳しいんではないかというふうに感じておりますが、なぜこういうサーベイを我々ディベロッパーがやっているかといいますと、いわゆるスウォット分析ですね、強み、弱み、オポチュニティ、スレッド、そういうのをすべて研究して、東京をより魅力的な都市にするために、何をするべきかというのを考えるためにやっているわけでして、都市化というのはどんどん進んでますから、2050年には、地球上の人口の3分の2、70億近くが都市に住むだろうと言われている中で、都市の魅力をさらに高めることが必要だと思っています。これちょっと見にくいかもしれませんが、薄い水色が、東京以外の3都市、ロンドン、ニューヨーク、パリです。で、濃い青が東京からオレンジの、ところがですね、アジアの都市ですね。アジアの主要都市。一番左、経済の分野でいくと、ニューヨーク、ロンドンが、トップ2です。その横の研究開発の分野でもニューヨーク、ロンドンがトップ2となってまして、東京も5位から R&D では4位と 肉薄しているというレベルだと思いますが、アジアの各都市も、経済以外は経済は随分ちょっと香港が今落ちてしまいましたけども、なかなか中盤から上の方にいるというのが分かると思います。ところが、左から3番目、文化交流ですね、カルチャルインタラクションでいくと、ロンドン、ニューヨークにパリがぐっと上がってきて、東京がいると。アジアの各都市はここでかなり点数を下げているというのが分かると思います。で、次の居住、リバビリティでなりますと、パリがなぜかトップの方に行くと。どういう指標で調べているかというと、いろいろあるんですけど、家賃もあります。から人口1000人あたりに起きる、殺人の件数っていうのもあったりとかですね、いろんな多くの指標でポイントをつけて都市ランキングをつけてるわけですけども、一度この居住、この発表をサンフランシスコで、先ほどデイビッドがサンフランシスコはいい街だとおっしゃってましたけど、あそこで発表したときにサンフランシスコの居住のランキングが非常に低かったんですね。その低かった理由が家賃が高いという時に、その地元の人から家賃が高いのは魅力的な住宅が多いからだろうって言って、文句が出たっていう、そんなところがありますので、我々としての森記念財団としてのサーベイですので、ご理解ください。これ見ていただくと、東京は比較的安定してます。ニューヨークとパリが実は右から2つ目の環境の分野でぐっとポイントを下げているのが分かると思います。東京はその環境が低いといっても、13位、14位レベルにいますので、全体的なパイチャートを書くと非常にきれいな四角で六角形になって、全体的な総合点は高いけども突出していい強みがないというところが分かります。こういうのを我々がサーベイすることで東京の魅力の何が欠けているのか、自分たちだけでできる、森ビルという一企業だけでできることもありますけども、そうじゃない、行政に働きかけてやるということも、してきたわけです。で、東京どうやって、東京というか街をどのようにして魅力的にするかっていう時に、先ほどの話が出ましたけども、いかにバーティカルに土地を使うかということです。これはちょっと模型で作りましたけど、3万平米の土地エリアにですね、300戸の住宅があります。大体1戸あたり平均100平米の住宅が2階建てで、それが300戸あって、それが道路とかをこう区切ると全体の敷地が3万平米ぐらいになります。東京によくある、東京のちょっと郊外に行ったところにはよくある、エリアだと思いますが、光景だと思いますけど、これをですね、50階建てのビル1棟に300ユニットを入れると、ほとんど少しの土地しか使われてないと。つまりこれで 3% しか使われてないんですね、土地の全体の。ということで考えると、97% の土地がこの敷地の中から有効にまた活用できるようになるということです。我々はこれを、バーティカルガーデンシティというふうに呼んでますけども、大事なことはただ単に高層ビルを、林立させるのではなくて、いかにこのように高層化をすることによってこのエリアをより効率的に、使っていくのかと。東京のようにやっぱり土地代が高くてですね、日本というのは山も多いのでなかなか平地が少ない中では、このような形で、都市部を活性化することが求められると思ってまして、そのための、手法といえば手法になると思います。先ほどもビルディングアウトする、この下の絵がまさにビルディングアウト、郊外にスプロールした街だと思うんですね。十数年前の確か国税調査で、都心3区に通勤する人の片道の平均通勤時間というのがですね、1時間12分だったと思います。 しかもそれが、とんでもないラッシュの、光景で、つまり2時間半近くがですね、毎日、オフィスで働く、都心部で働く人たちが通勤してこなきゃいけないと。こうすることによって、オフィスを建てて、住宅を建てて、この横の残った 97% のエリアには、オフィスを建てることもできます。病院を建てることもできます。もちろん、学校を作ってもいいし、緑の部分を、緑地を増やす公園を作ることもできると思います。こうすることによって、食住近接、その歩いて通えるオフィスに作るというのを、が可能になるということですね。我々はこのウォーキングディスタンスで行けるオフィスからオフィスというふうにやってまして、これがまさにその公共交通にも害を負荷をかけないと。ただ実はこの300ユニットをまとめるのはとても大変なんですね。ちょっといくつか例を示しますと、これ六本木ヒルズです。開発前はこのような左のところですけども、実はこのプロジェクトのスタートが1986年、完成が2003年ですので、17年かかりました。17年間、工事からは3年ですので、14年間ですね、全体をまとめて工事を着工するまでの間に、2000回の地元の人たちとのミーティングをして、了解をしてもらうと。14年間で2000回というと、大体年間140、50。ということは、2日か3日に1回は地元の人とのミーティングをして合意をもらうということをやってまいりました。これによって非常に未利用だった低いエリアがですね、高層化することが可能になりまして、そこで緑も増やすことができる。それから住戸も増やすことができる。ここでは840戸の住宅ができてまして、元の住民が400もいなかったですから、一気に増えたわけですね。あとこの右側の2つの写真、特に真ん中の写真見ていただくと分かりますが、とても細い路地があってですね、駐車車両が1台いると緊急車両はとても通れないと。ちょうど1995年に、阪神・淡路大震災があった時は、小さい路地の中に消防車両が入れなくて、火災活動で消火活動ができなかったという、救急車も入っていけないということですね。こういう街を、左側のような街を右側に変えていってる、これが六本木ヒルズです。これが虎ノ門ヒルズです。これはちょっと絵だけ見せますと、ここの場所はどちらかというと居住地区というか、古いオフィス街だったんですね。虎ノ門エリアということで、5階建て10階建てのビルが多かったのを一気に60階建て級のビルを、3本、あともう一つ住宅を作ってという感じで、ここも住宅としてはですね800ユニットにしてますので、住民がかなり増えてオフィスもあると。容積は実は前の間、その左側の時では多分250% ぐらいしか使ってないのが、右側になることによって、ほぼ 1000% 近く、10倍の容積まで作れるようになってますので、床を生み出したということと同時に、さっきお話したように空地も作ってきたわけです。これが今工事も進んでおります麻布台ヒルズです。これも左側のような路地や細かいって言っちゃいけないですね、小さい住戸があるところをこの後一気に大きな開発が進んでいるところです。このように高層化、一部のビルを高層化することによって、超高層化することによって新たな敷地を生み出して緑地も作ると。もっと言うといろんな機能をこの中に入れられるわけですね。例えばこの虎ノ門ヒルズですと、ミュージアムもありますし、ホテルも入りますし、クリニックも入りますし、インターナショナルスクールも入ってきます。から元からあったお寺もそこに残るというふうにできます。いろんな文化施設や公共施設、学校も含めた公共施設を一つの場所にまとめることが可能になって、アメニティも増えて、しかもそれが歩いていける場所となります。でこれがですね、六本木ヒルズの 表面の地表温度図です。これはできたのが六本木ヒルズができたのが2003年で、これが2007年の国土交通省の調査ですけども、明らかに周りのエリアと違って、グリーンなので地表温度が低いというのが分かると思います。CO2 排出対策に加えて、これはまさに地球温暖化対策になります。ヒートアイランド現象による地球温暖化対策になります。と、非常にこういう開発をすると良くなるという話をしてますけども、皆さんも多分気になると思うので、最近のコロナの後、オフィスはどうなるんだと。これ日経新聞の一面に一気に書かれました。富士通オフィス面積半減、日立グループ、パソナー淡路島まで行っちゃうと。ただオフィスは絶対なくならないんですね。オフィスという機能はなくならない。ただこれをもう一回再定義する必要があるというふうに思ってます。これはですね、六本木ヒルズの、出社率です。左の一番上がコロナの前で、100% 会社に、これを100としたときにコロナが始まりまして、一気に 10% 台まで下がって、緩やかに戻ってきてますけども、一番右が5月の、先週ですか。まさに5月7日に2類から5類に変えたにもかかわらず、まだ 48% と、非常に厳しいオフィスの空室ではないんですね、これは。出社をしてないと、空きがあるわけです。ただ、じゃあこれで空室率がどのくらい増えてるかというと、最後はこれですけど、この青い点線が上上がって下がって、一番手前が2020年の2月 1.49% という極めて低い空室率が今上がって、6. 点数%という、上がってもこのくらいなんですが、実は上海の空室率グレード A で言っても15、6% ありますし、ニューヨークも 12% ぐらいありますので、まだ 6% しか空室にはなってないんですが、ここで我々が今非常に気にしているのは、この緑の線が、日経平均です。日経平均が上がると空室率は下がる。日経平均が下がると空室率が上がる。経済の反映しているだろうというのを見るとですね、多少ちょっと遅効性があるので、それを見ていきますと、空室率と日経平均との逆相関がですね、ほぼ 0.88 というか 0.9 ぐらいまでものすごい関係してたのが、直近にきますと、まさにこの経済が日経平均が下がってないにもかかわらず、むしろ上がってるにもかかわらず空室率が伸びていると。これは何を意味しているかというと、やはりオフィスの在り方をこれから、景気だけではない、大きなマーケットだけではないオフィスの差別化が始まるだろうということを、考えなければいけないと。まだ我々自身も答えが出てませんが、やっぱり今までのようにただ来るだけのオフィスではなくて、そこで、アメニティも必要ですし、やっぱりサービスが必要だと。よくモビリティアズアサービスっていうのと同じように、アズアサービスというものがこれからリアルエステートにも求められるんではないかなということを考えて、会社の中では議論しているところですけれども、これからまた魅力的なオフィスを提供していきたいと思っておりますので、よろしくお願いします。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Yeah. So thank you very much for three really good panels. I just realized I should have probably been a little clearer about what I meant with U.S. policy. I wasn't talking about policy of U.S. versus other countries. I was thinking more in terms of policy within the United States. And what we've seen in recent years is, let's say the last 10, 20 years, is an enormous shift in population from northern cities to southern cities. And when at least economists look for the reason for the shift from places like New York to places like Dallas, Houston, Phoenix, etc., what they often point to is the high land costs in New York, and the driver of those high land costs is the combination of having high productivity, so high wages, high amenities, and the difficulty of building in those locations. Whereas in places like Houston and Dallas and Phoenix, it's very cheap to build. There basically are very few zoning restrictions there, which may make the cities feel soulless, but they also end up being cheap. And I think that is an issue, both in terms of preventing people from living in places like New York, and also in terms of the environmental impact. But I want to change gears a little bit and just talk about kind of your experience, that is each of the panelists' experience, in implementing sustainable design strategies. And you each kind of talked about different approaches to that, ranging from making the buildings themselves better to these zero emissions locations, to building tall buildings that also have greenery around them and more open space. What do you, I want to ask each of the panelists, kind of, what do you see as the principal barriers or difficulties in implementing the types of architecture, the types of buildings that you would like to see developed? We'll just go down in the same order. So I'll start with Andrés.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think this is a great question. And I would say that there's mainly two, and they were reflected, I think, in all the presentations. The first is the need for coordination. Sustainability requires the coordination of very different agents. And that was something that was discussed. And there's a difficulty in actually reaching alliances. We've seen that, for instance, at the level, how the level of the architecture is articulated at the level of the region. And it's crucial, because without those coordinations, the performance of a building alone can be counterproductive. And the same happened with the region, without the coordination. And the difficulty is that each of the stakeholders have come from very different logics and ways of analyzing risk and even time frames. And I think that's a difficulty, how to assemble them together. It's a question. And the other, I think, it's that the economies of sustainability are not easy to handle by individual actors. And we come from a tradition, or we come from a way of analyzing cost that is not including environmental cost. And there's been a huge effort in quantifying that through the hoteling formulas, for instance, or qualitatively analyze that, but somehow it keeps being difficult to distribute the cost of environment in the same, let's say, manner that it affects everyone. I think there's often a lack of public leadership on these processes, but also a fundamental difficulty of making things profitable with including the environmental cost. So I think somehow of coalition that allows to do that together as societies and also internationally, it's needed. So in a way, what I see is that the political structures need to be coupled with the ambition of cities to operate sustainably.
Yes, thank you. To build high-rise buildings, we need a big site. So we need to integrate the land. On the other hand, in Japan, especially, landing ownership right is quite strong. So we have to persuade them to join the project or to sell your property, but the negotiation time is quite long. For example, as I mentioned, Roppongi Hills, as for the Roppongi Hills, it took 17 years. So our team is exhausted. But fortunately, nowadays, we showed, we are able to show the good example like Roppongi Hills or Hills, so their understanding level is going up. But as I mentioned at the beginning, they called us invader. So it takes time.
Because there was recently a very important initiative that was the Columbia University with Holcim Foundation brought together people from many different fields, and some of them were developers, leaders of the industry, people that were working on finance, also engineers, architects, and there was a moment at the end that there were some conclusions. And there was one of the developers that said, well, what is important is to do it together. And do it together was very important because he would say, because the industry is ready to do this change. But of course, no one wants to be the first one because you would take much more risk than your competitors. So I think finding ways to bring together, like creating coalitions, could allow for other forms of leadership that are not necessarily only policy, but also the industry accepting to take the leadership in producing new forms of quality.
As for the Roppongi Hills, again, the biggest individual landowner was very good understander for Mori building. But it took time. Yeah, so individual mind is various. So somebody is understand and agree with our proposal. On the other hand, the other one is different.
Yeah, that's a major issue as well in the United States in terms of building. Is it easier? I'm just going to ask Mr. Mori. Is building in Tokyo particularly hard, or is it something that is hard everywhere in Japan?
I don't know the other side of Tokyo, but. Not bad in Tokyo, but just making a consensus is one big issue, and yeah, that's right.
Okay, I would actually love to continue this, but we have a hard stop at 5:20, and we're out of time. We have to allow for Minister Kono to come in. So I want to thank all of the panelists for a wonderful presentation, and I certainly learned a lot, and please join me in a round of applause.